19. And I am sure that the king of Egypt, God forearms his people, lest, suffering a repulse at their first onset, they should retire, and abandon in despair the work enjoined to them. It was, indeed, a hard thing to hear that their expedition would be vain, and that they might as well address themselves to the trunk of a tree, since there was no hope of reaching the obstinate heart of Pharaoh, but they would have been much more discouraged by this trial, if his stubbornness had been discovered unexpectedly. Therefore God foretells that their words would avail nothing, but at the same time he announces that he should succeed by his own wondrous power. If any think it absurd for these unhappy men to be wearied by their useless labor, and to be repulsed with ridicule and insult, I answer, that this was for the sake of example, and that it was advantageous for setting forth God's glory, that the king, having been civilly applied to, should betray his impious perversity, since nothing could be more just than that what he had unjustly refused, should be extorted from him against his will. But interpreters differ as to the meaning of the words. For some translate it literally from the Hebrew, no, not by a mighty hand, as though God said that the pride of the king would be unconquerable, and not to be subdued by any power or force, but the context requires a different sense, because the remedy is afterwards supposed to it, and I will stretch out my hand, and the result is added, that Pharaoh, overcome at length by the plagues, would let the people go. And this view is grammatically correct, for the Hebrews use the word vel, 45, velo, for accept. Therefore God commands his people to be firm and confident, although Pharaoh may not immediately obey, because he would evidence his power, 46, in a remarkable manner for their deliverance. In the meantime he arouses them to hope by the promise of a successful issue, since he will forcibly compel Pharaoh to yield, 21. And I will give this people favor. By this extreme exercise of his bounty he encourages the Israelites to contend and strive more heartily, since otherwise it would be hard for them to struggle with the great cruelty of the king. Therefore he promises them not only liberty, but also abundance of rich and precious things. But, inasmuch as this was hard to believe, that the Egyptians their bitterest enemies would become so kind and liberal as to exert such beneficence towards them, God reminds them that it is in his power to turn the hearts of men whithersoever he will. He proclaims, then, that he will cause these wolves of Egypt to become like lambs, and that they who used to bite and devour should now supply them with the very wool from their backs. This passage contains rich and extensive doctrine, that whenever men cruelly rage against us, it does not happen contrary to the design of God, because he can in a moment quiet them, and that he grants this license to their cruelty, because it is expedient thus to humble and chasten us. Again, we gather from hence, that we have no enemies so fierce and barbarous, as that it is not easy for him readily to tame them. If we were surely persuaded of this, that men's hearts are controlled, and guided by the secret inspiration of God, we should not so greatly dread their hatred, and threatenings, and terrors, nor should we be so easily turned from the path of duty through fear of them. This alarm is the just reward of our unbelief, when we repose not on God's providence, and although we ought to take pains to conciliate the kindness of all by courtesy, yet should we remember that our efforts will not gain their favor, unless God should so incline their hearts, 22. But every woman shall borrow. Those who consider these means of enriching the people to be but little in accordance with the justice of God, themselves reflect but little how widely that justice of which they speak extends. I acknowledge that it is his attribute to defend everyone's rights, to prohibit theft, to condemn deceit and rapine, but let us see what everyone's property is. Who will boast that he has anything, except what is given him by God? And all is given on this condition, that each one should possess according to his will whatever God pleases, who is free to take away at any moment whatsoever he has given. The Hebrews spoiled the Egyptians, and should the latter complain that an injury is done them, they would argue against God that he had transferred his own free gifts from them to others. Would this complaint be listened to, that God, in whose hands are the ends of the earth, who by his power appoints the bounds of nations, and reduces their kings to poverty, had deprived certain persons of their furniture and jewels. Another defense is set up by some, that the Hebrews took nothing which was not their own, but only the wages which were due to them, because they were iniquitously driven to servile labors, and had subsisted meanly upon what belonged to themselves. And certainly it would have been just that their labor should have been recompensed in some way. But there is no need of weighing the judgment of God by ordinary rules, since we have already seen that all the possessions of the world are His, to distribute them according to His pleasure. Nevertheless, I do not thus suppose Him to be without law, for although His power is above all laws, still, because His will is the most certain rule of perfect equity, whatever He does must be perfectly right, and therefore He is free from laws, because He is a law to Himself, and to all. Neither would I simply say with Augustine, 48, that this was a command of God which should not be canvassed but obeyed, because He knows that He commands justly, and that His servants must obediently perform whatever He commands. This indeed is truly said, and yet we must hold fast that higher principle, that, since whatever people call their own they possess only by God's bounty, there is no juster title to possession than His gift. We will not therefore say that the Hebrew women purloined that which God ordered them to take, and which He chose to bestow upon them, neither will God be accounted unjust in bestowing nothing but what was His own. The word which I have translated hospitum, or hostess, some understand as a fellow sojourner, and this is not very important, because we gather from the other word, that the Egyptians were mixed among the Hebrews. In the end of the verse, because the original expresses, "Ye shall put them upon your sons, and upon your daughters," almost all interpreters expound it to mean that they should ornament them, but it seems to me that it only refers to the abundance of the spoil, as much as to say, "You shall not only obtain as much as you can carry yourselves, but shall also load your sons and daughters."